right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the Tiny Bookstore Live on this, at least in Pittsburgh, bright and sunny Saturday afternoon. And I know that's rare to be able to say that in winter. So, as everyone knows, I'm Leah Bickerton. I'm one of the owners of the Tiny Bookstore. And the guest that I have with me today is Cindy Graham. And she's going to be talking, well, the original thing that we had her coming in for was to talk about oversharing. But while I was reading the news this morning, I saw an interesting article about, the mental health crisis that people are seeing coming because of the pandemic situation. So I sent her a quick text and let her know, hey, by the way, we're going to be talking about this too. So be prepared. And the sport that she is, she decided to go ahead and give a little bit of her insight on that. After our discussion with Dr. Graham, we'll be talking about the book Will by Will Smith and a few other things for the Tiny Bookstore community. But for now, what I'm going to do is introduce you to Dr. Graham. Cindy.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us on this, at least for us, bright and sunny afternoon.
Right.
And I appreciate your time. So let's just get into it.
Yep.
You saw the article that I sent you about the whole mental health crisis that people are foreseeing. And I guess to give everyone else a little bit of background, what people are saying is that with all of the stressors of the pandemic and just the not being sure of what's going on, that it's creating a crisis of proportions that we may not have seen before as far as anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorders, other types of mental health issues. And one of the things that I had a question about is that, what exactly do they mean? And do you think that this is actually going to be, the disaster that they're foreseeing?
Yeah, so I think based on the way that the article presented it, so there's been an increase in awareness in mental health services in general. So, from the perspective of someone, kind of out there providing therapy to people and also running a practice for people, a group practice. So of clinicians who see clients, we have certainly seen a significant increase in clients during the pandemic. So in that way, you could argue that, yes, certainly that there is a mental health crisis. I think the awareness of mental health needs has increased. So there were multiple things kind of happening at the same time. Prior to the pandemic, there's been a shift to reducing the stigma of mental health. And the pandemic kind of comes along and, certainly anecdotally speaking, again, from my practice, that's definitely something that we've been seeing, as well. I think, the larger issue of whether or not we should call it a crisis or not, I think, is going to depend on, time and kind of like, I think what the numbers and the data say. But so I guess it's kind of like a mixed bag kind of answer.
Right. So is it fair to say that it might be too early to basically get into panic mode about that?
So I think getting into panic mode regardless would be tricky. I think my main thing is, I would say that calling it a crisis is not necessarily unfair depending on what you mean. Because we are in a situation where there's a lot of need for mental health services and not necessarily the availability there.
Right.
And we can talk about that if it's relevant or maybe at some other time. But there are some aspects that make receiving mental health care difficult right now for multiple reasons. So in some ways, certainly using the term crisis would be fair. Again, I think with the pandemic has introduced, again, at least I can say from my perspective as a practitioner, there has been a significant increase in difficulty for clients now compared to, just prior to the pandemic. And again, I think it's just going to take some time. So for me in reading the article and, thinking about it afterwards, some of my thoughts were, yes, I think, again, it's kind of like the perfect timing of things. So because there's an increased awareness for mental health services, and then there's a pandemic, everybody's like, oh, wait, maybe I should go get myself into therapy,
Right.
Because we're all going through this thing right now. So
is it kind of fair to say that, because I think that when I read it as like a layperson, as lay as we can get about psychology stuff, I was thinking like, oh my gosh, like this is going to be like a huge, like a disaster of epic proportions. humanity as far as the
Got it.
phrasing is concerned,
Right,
but
right.
it's more that, hey, people should just be aware that there's an increase of this, and it's kind of bringing more of awareness to it. It's not necessarily, it's not a disaster.
Right.
It's just, all of these making people aware.
Right, right, right. Well, previously I would say, maybe prior to the pandemic, when we referred to a mental health crisis, we were kind of referring to it more so as like there's this issue that's lying below the surface that nobody's really talking about, that, people are really ignoring their mental health concerns. And
Mm-hmm.
now it's kind of switched over to be more so, a lot of people are in a state of distress right now. And, is there even the capacity or infrastructure, at least in the US and, probably a lot of places around the world, to really be able to support um, the mental health needs that come along with pandemics and just these types of really crisis types of situations and the impacts that they have. And I think also, and this isn't literature that I'm necessarily quite as read up on, but in terms of looking at situations in natural disasters, things like hurricanes or tornadoes, and the relief responses, and typically, what you see, there is an increase in stress and an increase in mental health needs for people during that time period,
Right.
for those people that are affected. So it does make sense logically that, we see an increase in mental health needs just like across the board, because this is something it's affecting everybody, and everybody's involved in it in some way. So I think in those ways it is fair to say crisis, but it's been this thing that's been like simmering and brewing for a long time.
Right. So not so much like, panic, just something that we're seeing like an increased, basically increased occurrences and increased, just awareness at the same time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, it is interesting to think about it that way. And maybe for me, as a psychologist, it gives me a different perspective, because when I hear crisis, like I think of crisis in very specific
Mm-hmm.
terms. And so for me, it's not like this doomsday kind of thing. For me, it's like, okay, we really need to make sure that providers are getting trained up. People are, insurance companies are reimbursing in a way that makes providers want to be in network so that people can use their benefits and things like that. So for me, when I hear crisis, I interpret it differently. I don't go to like a doomsday. I see it as like a supply and demand issue of like, there's not enough providers and it's going to get worse,
Right.
as opposed to, but I think, if we were to delve into more life-threatening aspects of it, for those who may have young children, some mental health topics that we may kind of delve into for a few minutes here might not be quite
So
so.
you might want to send them to the other room. And
Right.
honestly, for the rest of this particular Tiny Bookstore Live, you might want to send the kiddies to watch SpongeBob or something.
Yeah. So to address things like, thoughts of harming oneself or taking one's life. So suicide, that's something that, there have been particular trends about this, even prior to the pandemic, seeing increases in certain age groups and certain ethnicities and races, compared to others. But again, in a lot of ways, we've been seeing an increase in certain populations, certain races. And I think, again, it's partly because of an awareness of mental health issues for like across the board, as opposed to, and really what I'm saying, quite frankly, is that typically when you see stats that are reported on mental health, those stats are really driven mainly by non-Hispanic whites, both men and women, because they usually make up most of the pool of a given survey. That's not specifically targeting people of color or being inclusive for people of color. So what we had been seeing was increase in mental health diagnoses, like looking for services in people of color, Blacks, both Hispanic and non-Hispanic, and so on and so forth, Hispanics. So we've been seeing an increase in these things, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's partially because people have more awareness and more access, as people are getting diagnosed more appropriately, like it's getting better. So while things like suicide might not have been might not have been considered suicide before for a person of color, it is being classified in that way, in a way that's fair and appropriate because it was being basically misclassified before. So we were
Right.
seeing increases for some groups of people compared to others. And so, again, what the numbers are going to look like after the pandemic, I'm not sure. Again, we were kind of
But no
seeing.
one would know. If everyone had a time machine, we could have avoided this whole thing.
Right, right. So, yeah. So, I mean, do I think I don't necessarily think that there's going to be well, I don't know. Like, right. And then in 5 years, they're going to, you said on the Tiny Bookstore live show that
I
you didn't.
will. I will. I keep receipts. I do.
I hope that they don't increase. I can definitely say we have seen a significant increase in mental health concerns. A lot of clients increasing sessions, clients kind of returning back, an increase in looking for services, how it all shakes out.
But that's actually a good thing though, because people are actually going out there and seeking the resources. So it sounds to me like there's no need to panic. The headline might have been a little, I hate lingos and cliches, but clickbaity.
Right,
something to get all of our attention. It's just that, people need to be, I guess, as young people say, aware of their mentals, keeping on top of all that. So,
and I think an important thing to keep in mind is that it's particularly difficult to get in with psychologists at this point in time. So like doctoral level clinicians. And I think one of the important things, and that might be also contributing to the view of a crisis that, people are reaching out and they're not able to get those services. Is I think part of what people also have to keep in mind is that there are other avenues for therapy aside from doctoral level clinicians who are, very well trained and capable of treating the mental health concerns that you have. So, there are absolutely clinicians that are available and taking clients. Not everybody can see a PhD level clinician in the evening times after you get off of work,
right.
or after you get out of school. Everybody wants those times. And so, there are absolutely really well-trained clinicians who are able to see clients during the daytime. And this is where it kind of comes down to, again, so when you think about the idea of a crisis, if we're in a crisis, you're going to do whatever it takes to get those services.
Right.
So I would encourage people really, and again, this requires a balance then with employers of, really creating more flexibility for their employees and for their workers to be able to see healthcare, mental health care professionals during the daytime, because there's availability out there. With psychologists, yeah, it's gonna be difficult, more difficult. But again, there's more than one way to get therapy than from, a doctoral level clinician, and and those opportunities are out there.
So basically, people should just seek out whatever help they're able to get.
Yeah, and of course, you want to make sure that the person is trained in your area of your particular area of need, like that they have a specialty in it, and certainly, that they're appropriately licensed. Some people are what we call pre-licensed or provisionally licensed, so they may be supervised by. So perhaps the psychologist that you wanted to work with is completely booked and full, not taking new clients, but they supervise a provisionally licensed, a partially licensed clinician. It means they finished grad school, they've gotten some face-to-face hours. They're just finishing up the rest of their hours for full licensure. It's a phase we all have to go through to get to that full licensing. It's kind of different. I think the way to think about it in comparison to like a medical model is that, when someone graduates medical school, they're pretty much like out there fully licensed and practicing. It's just not the case in mental health. You have these other hurdles to go through, an additional training beyond the training that you already received while you were in grad school. So they are definitely capable of providing therapy in a very competent way. And again, they are supervised by a fully licensed person. And so sometimes that can be the way to kind of get therapy from that person that you might want to see through the supervision that they provide of their, of their kind of like master's level clinicians. So, yeah, just some food for thought. There are avenues out there. If you expand the way in which you view who can provide therapy, it really isn't just us psychologists.
But
It's
no, that's good stuff. I know that a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of that. And hey, we're here to give as much information as possible. So good stuff. But with that, we're going to go ahead and pivot a little bit to the topic of the day, oversharing.
Mhm.
So, what brought this to mind is that I've just watching things on social media, people just putting stuff out there, Will Smith passing gas in front of like Tua
That's
while working
funny.
out with the Miami Dolphins. I was just like, wow, like, what is going on with this oversharing? Like, is this normal? So, Cindy, talk to me about oversharing. Why do people do it?
Yeah. I mean, am I allowed to blame like reality shows and, and
Yes.
social media and how things are just easily, I mean, think about the draw of reality show. You're watching people do these things and, I hate to again bring psychology into all this, but psychology does speak to these types of behaviors too, that sensationalized extreme behavior are more likely to get a reaction compared to the regular everyday normal typical behavior. So, and then we start to think that that is the norm. Now, of course, like passing gas is the norm, like everybody does that. But the idea of like where and when it's done, there was the one, I didn't watch the show, but some other reality star that was selling it in a jar for like, I don't know, like $1,000 each.
Yes.
Our society has gone down this path of extreme reality, almost like extreme normalcy and I mean, I'm a believer in normalizing things. I certainly talk about bathroom behaviors with my clients because it's relevant to mental health. Are there people that enjoy seeing that? Sure. It got a lot of likes and views. People enjoyed it. People laughed. People thought it was funny. It's not necessarily the type of humor for everybody. So, I think so anyway, sorry, I probably digressed there. So to speak to oversharing, we are in a time period really worldwide where it's so easy to overshare compared to what it was before. Like everybody's got a platform. So now oversharing has become I don't want to say it's the norm, but at least it's the norm on social media. To be relatable and it can have some positive aspects to it, right? It lets people know, like, it reinforces the idea of like, yeah, hey, if Will Smith can pass gas in front of the Miami Dolphins, then, it's okay for me to do it in front of my loved one or something like that. But for me, it's kind of like, keep in mind the norms, like the social norms for your particular for your environment, for who you're around, for who you exist and interact with. Like, should you be cutting loose in the middle of a boardroom meeting? Probably not. That's
I guess my question is these are things that can be edited. And the first one, okay, yeah, cool. But it, it was like bombs over Baghdad, Cindy.
Oh, so I only saw the one little clip that you sent me. Was it a repeated thing? And I mean, I certainly was not an athlete, so I don't know whether that's a norm for athletes in that way. But
I guess my question is like, it's completely natural. I get that,
Mhm.
but do we really need to share all 3 or 4 that we saw there? Like, and that's kind of like we're seeing a lot of this, and I understand, wanting to be opening, and I think that openness and sharing is healthy because for too long in society and the world, things that are important have been just kind of swept under the carpet because, we don't want people
Right.
knowing too much. And that was unhealthy. But I kind of feel like we're swinging too hard in the other direction as far as, just where are those boundaries? Like people putting relationship stuff out there.
Right. And so there is a line there, and there's a line, there's the line of research that actually gets into friendship and like relationship building and when it's too soon to start divulging certain information compared to others. And there certainly is a time period of whether it's a romantic relationship or just a platonic relationship of where if you tell them too much too fast, it's awkward and weird and is almost harmful to the relationship dynamic, as opposed to it kind of getting further down the road and kind of appropriate for it. So it is definitely a thing, and oversharing does happen too much. I think for me, the bottom line is, the ways in which it comes out. So the way that I would approach it with for somebody in therapy would be, what are like the impacts that are happening for you? So, are there some rewards, like it goes viral and everybody's talking about it, but then are the negative consequences of like that's what everybody's referring to you as, or maybe you're losing some friends in reality because of how much you're oversharing. And then we talk about, well, let's look at this balance of, you know, what is the negative impact that it's having for you? Like, what is it that you want to change about this situation? And let's go from there, because part of it is learning, media is still media. And whether
Right.
it was things that hit the news on TV 20 years ago or things that go viral on the internet, we know that things that are sensationalized are the things that are going to get popular. So it's kind of like it is an old problem just presented in a different kind of way of knowing for yourself, like, is this a way in which you want to live your life? Like, do you want your life to be overshared? Like, let's think about also then for celebrities, as much as they may overshare with certain aspects of their lives, there are other aspects where they don't. And we have a lot of celebrities like, Beyonce and Jay-Z that have gone to great lengths to protect their children from the media until they're like ready to put them out there. So there's a balance to sharing. And I think that ultimately is the most important thing that people have to keep in mind is, are you considering the costs and the benefits of it and how it lines up for you and how it aligns with the relationships because that's the other part of it too, is to what extent is your oversharing implicating other people? Is it just you? Are you the only one that's being impacted, or is it affecting other people that you care about too? So, and I think just not falling into the pitfalls of social media and, that can be pretty appealing and alluring, and remembering that that's really still not reality. As
Right.
much as they try to normalize, and it's still not real life. It's somebody's broadcasting of what they want to portray in that particular moment that may or may not be real of their own life.
Okay, so if the parents were to bring their kids in from watching SpongeBob for a few minutes, get them off of the Xbox, what would you advise, kids and other youths? Because we know that it's not just adults that are on social media, and kids are getting their social cues and their adjustment from what they're seeing online.
Right.
So I guess my question is, how do you train them the difference between what's acceptable and what's not, what's appropriate and what's not?
Yeah, and so that's certainly this topic can cross over into so many. Like, it makes me think of a recent article from I think maybe Wall Street Journal about TikTok and teens diagnosing themselves with things. So that is the perfect example of where oversharing can go wrong, is that somebody starts to then identify with something and then assume and then believes that that's what their struggle is as well. And you don't know whether the person who is sharing this is acting, just flat out acting like this is a public character that they put out there versus who they are in private, versus were they even diagnosed appropriately? Are they even describing their symptoms in a way that is actually similar to how you experience them? There's so much that goes into it. So for parents, it's really being vigilant of what your kids are seeing on social media, and reinforcing that with instilling values and the values that are important, the values and morals that are important to you as a family, and helping them to understand where that ends and begins with respect to social media, and really treating it as what you see on the internet is really no different than if it was just coming off the TV. And just let's take the label of like reality TV. It's just TV. It's entertainment. It's people presenting a certain. I mean, even us here right now, like there is a as much as we're trying to be ourselves, we're still like on camera. Like,
Yes.
and there's a there's a difference that just happens quite naturally, even if you are as much of your authentic self as possible. And not to say that you're not being authentic, but part of what kids are developing is that sense of like what is true and what is not true. True, and not true on the internet. What is something that's substantiated across credible platforms, or
Right.
sources of information versus those that are not. So for parents, it really is, it's similar to how our parents would tell us about what we saw on TV or saw in a movie or, anything like that. It's really sitting down and having conversations with them about it, and letting them know how to look at things from multiple perspectives, and then just reinforcing the idea of, that might be okay for their culture. That might be something that's okay for their culture, for their society, their area, and explaining the difference for you and your family, your city, your town, your village, and why that's your beliefs, why that's different from, we grew up very much in a household where they were like, y'all are not being raised like everybody else is.
Yep.
Like they're not our children, you're not their children. So like,
Yep. Shout out mom and dad.
right. Like we grew up knowing, don't expect that you're going to be doing and behaving in the same ways as everybody that you see around you. And again, that's not a bad thing. I'm definitely thankful, that they raised us in that way.
So basically what we're looking at here is making sure that it's part of the social development. It's just in a different platform. And the problem is that it's going worldwide.
Yes.
So it's one thing for you to do something at your high school. It's another entirely to do it on the internet, because
For the world.
yes, the internet really is forever and it's going worldwide. So yeah, like I get that. And I think that there's something you mentioned about the fact that people are doing this for promotional purposes. And when you said that, I'm just like, oh, dang, that makes sense for some of what I saw there. Because one of the things that Will Smith mentioned in his YouTube series was that he basically studied fame and what it takes to get to different levels of fame. And that's actually something that's also included in the book. The dude is very, truly brilliant individual, like great mind for science and statistics, all of that. So kind of what popped into my head when you said that is just like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, because a lot of that, gross out humor, what sells now is being relatable. And if Will Smith can do that while Tua, Heisman Trophy winner right there, bossing up to the internet, like that's interesting. And I think that, but as far as a parent, this is Big Will, he's expensive, he's wealthy, he's powerful. How do you tell your kids, look, Will can do that, and maybe when you are a multimillionaire, maybe you can too? Is that the good approach, or do you have a better idea? Because how I'm just kind of blunt about it.
Actually, to continue on with the Will example, like that's a really good example, because I want to say, I can't remember where I saw it, but it was some interview that he gave where he was talking about his level of accessibility and openness. So he said how back in the 90s, when he was like Big Willie style, he was like Mr. Independence Day weekend, like he had the summer blockbusters every year. He said that back then, the thing to do as a star was to be elusive and to not be out there and to be very selective in the interview. So it was the exact opposite of oversharing. It was specifically be mysterious, keep that under wraps. So that will motivate people to be like, oh, when you have a movie come out, they're going to like flock because they don't see you that much other than in the movies.
Right. It's kind of like Frozen 1, conceal, don't feel, don't let it show, etc.
Right. So then 20 plus years later, he then says, with social media, you're now competing with the fact that there are stars out there who are relatable. They have all these huge followings on social media, and they're the ones that are getting booked. And again, if you think about it for a studio, that makes sense. Like they're reaching people, they're building an audience and a following, that these are people that you can then easily get to go see the movie. So then we'll acknowledge the fact that he then had to shift and put himself out there. And then you got oversharing.
Yes. And that's where it truly, when you said that, it's just like, oh, dang, I kind of had a feeling that it was in that direction, but it all came together. It's like, Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen The Sixth Sense over the last 23 years. But I had an experience like at the end of The Sixth Sense where just all started to just kind of be clear to me because, again, very brilliant, very aware of what it takes to make it. But I think that one of the dangers here is that when you have people where their objective is fame and going viral and being, is it an influencer, a creator, or
yeah, it's all an influencer, a micro influencer,
right.
You know, guru. Yeah,
it's the attention economy. And I think that a lot of times when you're younger, you don't necessarily have all of the tools that come with adulthood to know, like, okay, there are going to be lifetime repercussions for this.
Right. And so to get back to your question about like what should a parent do, let them see. Well, I can't remember to what extent Will curses in the interview, but interviews like that are really important for parents to show their kids the documentary, the social experiment. I'll have to look that up. It was on that.
Like Google it and we'll post it in the comments later.
These different like documentaries and looks into the idea of like people are doing what they're doing on the internet so as to get popular, so as to get endorsements, so as to get you on their platforms, on their apps, buying their products, doing these. And don't let me be a hypocrite, right? Like, so I'm on social media, you know, and I recognize that social media is a great way to get exposure for my company and, you know, for myself. And, you know, there are time periods I had a reel where I had my son in it with me, one of my sons in it with me just earlier in the week. So I understand the value of being out there, you know, and, you know, do I consider myself trying to like, you know, manipulate people or try to get fame? No, I don't want fame like that actually. But I think there is value in, and so one parent should not necessarily assume that like everybody's out there trying to like exploit you to spend your money and things like that, right? Like there are people who really truly have a genuine heart for like educating. So part of what you have to do is teach your kids what's the difference between those people who are trying to like educate you, and then maybe sell you something on the side, right? Like an educational course or whatever and what have you, versus, you know, people that are pursuing like fame and notoriety for fame and notoriety's sake because of the money that it brings in that way. And
it's the Happy Meal conundrum.
The Happy Meal conundrum.
Let me explain. So with the Happy Meal, they're selling the toy. Okay. But what they're not a toy store. They're slinging burgers. That's where their cash is. So you have to be aware of the ones who are, you know, just basically giving you the frivolous stuff just for your attention, because that plastic toy is going to be in a dump somewhere and generally useless. But at least that greaseball burger is going to sustain you for a little bit.
Right.
The Happy Meal conundrum.
Right. So yeah.
Patent pending.
You have to sit down with your kids and talk with them. And show them these interviews by these stars where they talk about, you know, why they're making the decisions to do what they do. And, you know, Will has a book out. So, you know, fair, you know, he's got a book to promote. Like it is what it is. You know, and even if it's not just for the book, like it is what it is. That's his life. That's how he's choosing to live it. Part of what kids have to keep in mind and what parents have to explain to them is that like the internet lives on. And so at some point, you know, presumably as a kid or a teen, you're going to grow up and you're going to want to get a job, or you're going to want to get married, or you're going to want to go to college. And the things that live on the internet are searchable via, you know, all the various search tools that we have. So you are making it easier for people to see and to see the things that you do and don't do. And keep in mind, like these companies that you want to work for, these colleges that you want to go to, and the people that you may want to date, like they have a brand of their own that they want to protect. And they want to make sure it's a particular type of people who are aligned with it. Again, all fair. They have the right to do that.
But I think that one of the complicating factors, though, is that when people see that, you know, okay, this is going to make me notorious, it's going to live on forever on the internet. But if I get rich now, who cares? How do you deal with that?
That is some short-sighted thinking that tends to happen. And it's understandable, right? That like that money that's fast and quick is very appealing. Sometimes people don't realize what they don't know. It's hard to know what might be waiting for you on the other side of that quick fame.
Right.
I mean, history really shows us what tends to happen. Outcomes aren't awesome necessarily, like especially if
Right.
you're not equipped or prepared to handle that fame, that stardom, that money, like it all goes away, or you can have some negative outcomes. So I would say, like, if you are specifically pursuing the, hey, I'm going to be the bad guy, like that's my character, make sure that you're protecting yourself about that. And I mean, if you're a kid and a teen, my general thought is that you're a bit too young to really make that decision at this point in time. Uh, Again, because you don't know what turns life is going to take for you down the road. And what if you want to pivot or change your brand or your persona? That might not
Right.
necessarily be so easy. You get typecasted, pigeonholed into this one particular thing. Um, so I think parents staying involved with their kids, in social media, really limiting their access to social media until kids are really age appropriate, monitor what types of accounts that the kids are on and following, help them to have discernment about like what's entertainment versus what is what's actual fact. And even then, it's okay to check a few sources and not just go off of one,
Right.
one reputable source, because there are different perspectives anyway. But I mean, it's a tough road and it's a journey. And I think even in the cases where, hey, maybe your kid does not care, their mind's made up, they're going to do what they're going to do. You're providing, the support, the emotional and mental support that your child needs to be able to handle, what may or may not come their way. Because even if we're not taking it again on the level of like the whole world is going to see this from you, even if it's just your classroom or your neighbors, that can be socially debilitating and take some time to recover from if you end up putting something out there and you could end up getting bullied for it and whatnot. And kids just being in a sensitive time of development anyway, that kind of mix of I thought this through, I know what I'm doing, it's fine, my friends will appreciate it, versus like, oh snap, my friends all turned on me and I
Right.
didn't see it coming. So yeah, I think it's in a lot of ways, hang in there, parents. If you feel like you're struggling with it, you're not alone. Just kind of be that steady drumbeat of like discernment and really helping them to figure things out. Keep in mind, again, most everybody as a teen kind of went through a phase of making decisions that weren't ideal. The difference certainly now is that kids are doing it in a much more public way. I think as much as cancel culture has been a thing, that is also ebbing and flowing. People are pushing back on cancel culture and saying, no, like I'm going to keep doing what I'm going to do. I'm not going to, give up this level of, you know, uh, attention that I'm getting, or this platform. And so I think really for me, the underlying thing is balance. So whether it's oversharing, um, you know, or not, it's that balance. Like kids are going to want to take part in the things that are popular, and that's okay too. And parents should recognize that. And that's healthy and understandable. And so there is that balance between like, I'm a social person, I want to be doing the things that other kids my age are doing, and then the line of like oversharing being too much. So, oh, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So I think that this is a pretty good stopping point. I think that great information here about, why people overshare, why it's not necessarily the best idea. Parents, show your kids the statistics about what YouTubers and people on Twitch actually make, the numbers out there. Help give those kids those guidelines. And Cindy, pleasure as always having you on. I look forward to the next time.
All right. Bye.
All right.
Thank you.
Later. All right. So, again, one of the things that really did get me thinking about the whole thing of oversharing is Will Smith, who also happens to be the author of the book that I am discussing today. So, Will, I to try to really pigeonhole this particular book is going to be a little bit complicated. It is an autobiography, but I think that it's fair to say that it's kind of a mission-based autobiography. I tend to assume that a lot of books by celebrities will tend to be just kind of plays to their ego, just kind of talking about things that happen in the industry, weren't necessarily written by them, so on and so forth. So I have low expectations going into this particular type of book to begin with, and I'm going to circle back to that in a little bit. So I was a little bit I was pleasantly surprised to see that there's actually a good purpose and a good idea and things to really learn that are coming through this book. So Adson and I were talking about the issue of oversharing and how it's something that can work to your benefit, and it can be something that's helpful as long as it's done, with your eyes wide open. I think that that's where I would classify Will after reading the whole thing, because I've been with y'all watching what's been being placed on the internet and just the information that they've been putting out there, and I didn't get it. But it wasn't until I'd say about page 338 in the book that it finally sunk into me that basically what he's trying to do is to let people know that what you're seeing out there isn't necessarily what's real, and to try to encourage people to do a little bit better. So I think that, whether that was his intent or not, I know that's what I'm going to take away from it. Because as someone he's got a very obsessive type personality. He mentioned that one of the things his father told him was that, if you go out to do something, there are two options. You're either successful or you're dead. That's not necessarily a healthy way of thinking, but a lot of people who are highly motivated do tend to think that way, that you're either the top of the world or you're trash, you're perfect or you're worthless, with no in between. And it looks like that particular level of just gung-ho 100% served him very well. He came from basically living from a household that was in poverty to being the biggest movie star in the world, and that is amazing. Grammy winner, Oscar nominee. That level of motivation, not everyone has it, and not everyone can reach those heights. And as I'm going through and reading the book, it's just like, okay, yeah, like that's a really rough thing to go through, but you're still super rich, and that motivation served you. And as someone who was raised to be like, a very motivated individual, to get things accomplished, to take no excuses, I was just like, okay, this is a little extreme, but I kind of get the point, because that's how you reach those high highs. But as the book kind of goes on, you start to see that when you push it quite to the extent that he did, it created imbalance in his life and misery for his friends and family. And that's where I know that there's the adage that too much of a good thing can in fact be bad. And I think that having too much hustle and too much motivation, it can actually end up being a bad thing. And that's pretty much the story of this book. It also gets into how those particular tendencies have a ripple effect as far as your children are concerned. And as a parent, that's something that really resonated with me. You always want to motivate your children, and you want them to succeed and be the best that they can be. But it's important to make sure that they're not doing that to the detriment of their mental health and their happiness. And what ended up happening with Will Smith is that he ended up being wildly successful beyond anyone's dreams except for his. But the problem is that even though he had all of that, he had a miserable family. And I think that that's ultimately one of the missions of his particular book, is to say, you know what, go out there and get what you want in the world, but also make sure that part of what you want is happiness and balance and joy for your family. And I think that with hustle culture, that's something that's really missed and it's overlooked. And one thing that we're seeing more in this day and age is that people are taking that time to take a step back and consider that. And what I would recommend for people who are reading Will or looking to encourage other people to read it, it's that as you're rethinking your life, as you're considering where you're going in the future, and as you're considering your goals, always weigh that against, okay, what's the cost for this? But to basically dig a little bit more into the book, just to kind of give you a feel for what it's like. I can't say that I can really say that this is exactly like any other book. It's like a cross between an autobiography and a self-help book, but also a little bit of a horror story in some ways. It is very funny. Will Smith is a natural comedian. But the reason why he is a natural comedian is honestly because of a little bit of trauma. And I think that one of the great parts of the book is that it does show you what happens when you start to explore why it is you do certain things that you do. He was a funny guy, he was a clown. Why was that? The book kind of explains why it is exactly that is. It's at the core of it was unfortunately, trauma. He took that trauma and monetized it, but it's still something that was there. So another interesting thing about the book is that you have to understand that Will Smith is a little bit of an unreliable narrator. He actually addresses that in the second chapter of the book, just saying that, hey, when he's telling a story, people often have to tell you what actually happened. And I think that that's something to carry with you as you're going through the book. And I think that that element of him being an acknowledged unreliable narrator is that you're kind of wondering, okay, is this something that he's exaggerating? Did it actually happen like this? There are certain details that jumped out at me where, he mentioned that he felt like he was going to put blue paint on his face like Braveheart, but the incident that he was talking about was about 4 years before Braveheart came out. So I think that that's a little bit more of the storyteller and not necessarily the historian of Will Smith. Now, as far as the overall writing skill that's in the book, it's actually relatively well written. The language is great. It's to be expected because Will Smith does write for a living, or at least he used to as a rapper. So the way that he uses phrases, it was kind of fun to just see the turns of phrase that he uses because they are kind of unique. There are some clunky parts. There are a few typos. And I have to say that there was one part that just kind of made me stop. And it's basically when he made a little bit of a misstatement about the law. So let me go right into it. So after he was in an incident that ended up with him being arrested. Yeah, Will Smith was arrested. I was shocked too. He said, apparently there is an arcane law in Pennsylvania, the master/slave clause, that states that if one person commits a crime under the control or direct influence of a master, then the master is legally liable for the actions of the submissive/slave party. The man's legal team argued that because of my dominant relationship with Charlie, I was culpable for his actions. Now, when I read that, I'm just like, okay, come on, man. Like, you couldn't hand this to the person on your team that went to law school in Pennsylvania because as far as master-slave law, one, it's respondeat superior. It's something that's covered in the first year of law school in torts. So I wouldn't necessarily call it arcane or specific to Pennsylvania. It's literally taught all across the great USA. So yeah, like I said, that just kind of struck me wrong. So for those of you who actually care about what that is, it's employer-employee liability. If someone is working for you and they do something that's within the scope of their employment, that's part of their job, then congratulations. You might end up being on the hook for it. So if your bodyguard goes out and cold clocks someone, you might end up having to pay for it. So not arcane, not special. That's not unique to Pennsylvania, not master-slave, master-servant, employer-employee. But again, I'm not sure if that was an error in editing or going back to the storytelling aspect and the unreliable narrator. But yeah, as you can tell, that really did grind my gears, that something like that made it into such a widely published book. But ultimately, as far as the book overall, I think that taking it back to the entire idea of oversharing, I get it. Like he is basically telling, and as I was reading through the book, it reminded me of a line from Izzo by Jay-Z, where he was talking about how like he's not telling people to go out and sell drugs. The reason why he's rapping about what he did was to keep people from doing the same things that he did and to make those same mistakes. And I honestly think that that might be the purpose of Will, is to get people to not follow down this particular path and make the same mistakes that he did. Yes, he's wildly successful. He did things that were unhealthy for him and his family to get there. And perhaps we should not do those same things when we're trying to go through and live a fulfilling life. So overall, I found that Will was a very interesting read. I think that one of my personal issues that I have to work on is that I have a bias against celebrity authors. It turns out that, like, I have low expectations for it, and that's not necessarily fair. So I think that part of my personal growth in this is going to be to not judge a book by its author. All right, so next up is a little bit of critical reading. One of my great passions in life is getting people to, not just be a crank who's just questioning everything with no justification and just kind of challenging things for no good reason. What I like for people to do is just kind of make sure that we have a good and clear understanding of what's going on, in the world. And I know that one of the things that people talk about, this entire fake news, well, trying to vilify the media, that's not what I'm here for. What I'm saying is that articles are written by humans. Humans are not perfect. There are going to be mistakes. And one of the mistakes that we make as readers is that a lot of times, instead of reading a whole article, we'll read the headline and then just call it a day. And what we're going to do now is look into one of those reasons why you can't judge an article from its headline. So last week, this particular article came up in The Guardian that says U.S. teacher accused of giving COVID vaccine to teenager against mother's wishes. And they were talking about how she was arrested for that, other articles with their headlines saying that, New York teacher arrested for vaccinating teenager without parents' permission. When I saw that, I'm just like, okay, that's pretty interesting because, yeah, don't get me wrong, that's terrible to be vaccinating someone without the parents' permission. But one of the bigger things that hit me was it's kind of not permitted to be just going around jabbing people and giving them injections unless you're actually a medical professional. So I'm going to pop this back up here. And as you can see, it says that Laura Russo, who teaches on Long Island and is not a trained medical professional, faces up to 4 years in prison. I think that, yes, it's bad that she did the COVID vaccine without getting parental permission. It's also really bad that she's out here practicing medicine without any type of license. We don't want people going around giving people jabs for anything. I don't care if it's for the chicken pox or the flu. If you're not a licensed medical professional, that shouldn't be happening. But that's something that was buried in there, not necessarily up out front in that headline that you're seeing. So the moral of the story is, again, don't just judge an article by the headline and read through the entire thing. Now, we're not going to read through that whole article today. I was using this just as an example to everyone that, okay, there is valid information in the article. The headline was a little on the misleading side. So just be careful with that. Read through the whole thing and always verify sources. Okay, so next, our February reading group selection. It's been over a year since we've had a reading group pick because things have been a little wild and COVID-y around here, so haven't really had the time to commit to doing that. So I am excited to bring this back, and it's a book that it's been a long time since I've read it, and I'm looking forward to rereading it with you all. And it's called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community by Martin Luther King Jr. And it is actually the last book that Martin Luther King Jr. ever wrote. And just to give you a little bit of a description, in this prophetic work, he lays out his thoughts, plans, and dreams for America's future, including the need for better jobs, higher wages, decent housing, and quality education. With a universal message of hope that continues to resonate, King demanded an end to global suffering, asserting that humankind, for the first time, has the resources and technology to eradicate poverty. This is an election year, so a lot of what you're going to be seeing from the Tiny Bookstore as far as the books we're recommending and our educational and lifelong learning content is going to be about civic awareness and what the path forward is going to be. Last year, I felt kind of conflicted because there's so much that I wanted to do to help make progress, help make the world better as far as, equality, social issues, but I wasn't sure what to do. So instead of just doing things blindly and not in a strategic fashion, I took a step back and asked myself, what is actually going to be helpful and productive? Are we just going to look backwards? Am I just going to put ideas out there and no guidance as far as what the path forward is going to be? And one of the reasons why this did just kind of pop into my head is like when I was doing this thinking last year was that I was trying to find a way to do a book talk with just about everyone as far as after we read The New Jim Crow back in August of 2020. And someone asked, what exactly is going to happen going forward? And I'm like, well, that's a good question. I don't know. And although I knew that I could do the research and find the books to do that, it just seemed like I didn't know which direction to take. So again, took a step back, started going through and thinking, what books informed my thinking and what great thinkers and people with, solid qualifications had ideas that are out there. You don't necessarily want to reinvent the wheel, especially if it's well designed and one that we haven't really used well enough. So, I dug this one out of the memory and decided that that's what I'm going to be doing going forward. I'm going to do what I can to help people be informed of what the history was, but also challenge you to read things, to start thinking about what is going to be going on going forward. So if you're interested in doing this, it's available at the public library. And you know me, I love supporting local libraries. And a quick thing on that. Someone else asked me whether I considered the library to be our competitor. Why am I so pro using the public library? The way I see it, we are all minority shareholders in the public libraries. It's a resource for all of it. I don't see that as competition. I see that as part of the team for educating the public and lifting us all up. So I would love it if you bought this from us. What I want is for everyone to go out there and read this because it really will help move us forward. And I will be talking about the book towards the end of February, date to be determined, but it's going to be another stream. We're going to do it in a nice civil fashion because that's going to be the baseline as far as discussions in the tiny bookstore community. We're not going to hold people's opinions against them. Now, are we going to draw a line when it comes to hateful conduct, hateful speech? Yes, we're going to address that. But this is not going to be a place where people are going to be vilified. There is going to be no name calling. I don't care if you're left, right, center, whatever. What we're going to be doing is actually talking about ideas and hopefully getting people so that we can work together to have progress, because that's the only way that it's going to happen, is that individual citizens educate themselves and listen to others, so that way we can work together for some type of progress that works for everyone. I know that we're hearing a lot about how the U.S. and the world is so unbelievably divided, but there is far more that we agree with than disagree with. Everyone wants to be happy, right? Okay, most people want to be happy. We want our kids to be well educated. We want to succeed in life. So let's start trying to find those things that we agree with and go from there. We want equality. We want fair play. So let's get in there and start talking about that. So that's going to be one of the objectives for the Tiny Bookstore community in 2022 and going forward. Now, before I sign off for the day, I have one extra book recommendation that I didn't mention, but as I was looking through it, I realized that the beginning of the year is a good time to do it. This book is called In Case You Get Hit by a Bus: How to Organize Your Life Now for When You're Not Around Later. So one of the reasons why I think that this is an important book, especially at the beginning of the year, some people are all about new year, new you. I don't really buy into that. I think that to a certain extent, it's kind of toxic. I love me. I love me exactly as I am. I think that people should love themselves exactly as they are. So the entire idea that you have to go and change something about yourself, big change because it's the beginning of the year, not a fan of that. Not going to encourage that. That's not how I roll. The Tiny Bookstore is an extension of me. So that's not how we're going to do it. I want to encourage people to do things a little bit better, make themselves a little bit happier. But one of the other things that we want to make sure that we're doing is preparing for the future. Tomorrow's not promised. And when bad things happen in life, we want to make sure that on top of trying to cope with what's happening to lose a loved one, we don't want to have to necessarily leave our loved ones to deal with the mess of digging through unresolved things that you have going on with your life. So what this book does is it really gives you the information that you need to start gathering things together to make the winding up of your affairs more straightforward. This is not a fun read. You can tell that from the title. Getting hit by a bus, not necessarily a fun thing, but it has a slightly lighthearted twist to something that is very serious and unfortunately very necessary. I don't care what age you happen to be, you want to make sure that you're preparing for the things that we don't want to talk about. End of life care. Where's the password to your bank account? What's the password to your iPhone? Where do you keep the keys? How often does the dog need to be fed? All of these various things, they're recommended as far as being adequately covered and put in, a place where people can find it. So what I would recommend is that, after you read this book, if you happen to purchase it, write along what you're doing and keep the materials with this book and put it in a safe place to make things better for your loved ones and whoever else is wrapping up your affairs when you're no longer here to really see your affairs on your own. Another benefit to this is that it also helps in situations where you may still be physically here, but incapacitated. Again, not fun stuff to talk about, but I think that at the beginning of the year, as you're going through and thinking about goals going forward, while you're pulling together things to do your taxes and all of your books, now is a great time to start making those copies and writing down those details to just kind of prepare for, this unfortunate, but hey, it's going to happen to every single person walking the planet. So you might as well be prepared for that end of life situation. So that is the Tiny Bookstore Online for this week. Join us next week for a talk about pediatricians and how you can actually get the best and maximize that particular resource and, get the best outcomes for your kids by using your pediatrician as a part of your team. So with that, thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday. Thank you, Dr. Graham, for joining us on the Tiny Bookstore Live, and I will see you all next week, 3 o'clock.